Slavery is not a national evil. On the contrary, it is a national benefit. The agricultural wealth of the country is found in those states owning slaves, and a great portion of the revenue of the government is derived from the products of slave labor.
That was the very statement of Governor Stephen D. Miller in his 1829 speech to South Carolina's legislators concerning slavery. In a world where such insane depravity was legal, the black man, woman, boy, and girl were in a hostage of unimaginable terror, and the only way towards freedom for them was rebellion. Slave rebellions carried bloody consequences. Rebels were executed. Family, friends, and neighbors might be beaten and killed. In some cases, slaveholders placed bloodied and dismembered bodies in public view to remind passers-by of their awful power. Still, in the midst of these terrors, enslaved people rebelled.
Slavery itself was such an abomination that I could see how it would drive men and women to do desperate things. And a slave revolt, by its nature to me, is a pretty desperate act.
In the story of Nat Turner, we see a shining example of what it means to stand up for what is right, even in the face of adversity. Turner dared challenge the oppressive system of slavery and ignited a rebellion that would shake the very foundations of history. Before we continue on our journey down this remarkable history of America's deadliest slave revolt, support our works by hitting the thumb button below, share with friends and families to keep spreading awareness, and subscribe to stay tuned in to our channel for more interesting, eye-opening Black narratives. Now, let's get back on the road. Nat Turner, who, in as recent as 2002, was included by scholar Molefi Kede Asante in his list of 100 greatest African Americans, and has been depicted in films, literature, and plays, as well as many scholarly works, was an enslaved black carpenter and preacher who led a 4-day rebellion of both enslaved and free black people in Southampton County, Virginia, in August 1831. Nat Turner's slave revolt, historically known as the Southampton insurrection, and known to be the most deadly slave revolt in the history of the United States, was a terrifying and significant event that challenged the American system of slavery and had lasting repercussions. In the annals of time, this is an event that stands as a stark reminder of the deep-seated struggles against depression. As we journey through the layers of this historical narrative, we will come to understand not only the actions of Nat Turner and his followers, but also the complex web of social, economic, and cultural factors that laid the groundwork for this extraordinary event. Born into slavery on October 2nd, 1800, in Southampton County, Virginia, Turner knew only so little about the background of his father, who was believed to have escaped from slavery when Turner was a child. However, Turner grew up much attached to his grandmother. Southampton County was a rural plantation area with more black people than white. Benjamin Turner, the man who held Nat and his family as slaves, called him Nat in his records, a name he had borne from infant until his adult age. But after the 1831 rebellion, he was widely referred to as Nat Turner. Turner learned how to read and write at a young age. He was identified as having natural intelligence and quickness of apprehension, surpassed only by few. He grew up deeply religious and was often seen fasting, praying, or immersed in reading the stories of the Bible. Turner had grown into a charismatic leader among his fellow slaves, revered for his wisdom and unwavering commitment to the cause of freedom. In the early 19th century, the southern United States was a hotbed of slavery, with Virginia, where Turner was, being a prominent hub. The prevailing view of Southern politicians and intellectuals just before the American Civil War was that slavery was a positive institution, as opposed to seeing it as morally indefensible or a necessary evil. They defended the legal enslavement of people for their labor as a benevolent, paternalistic institution with social and economic benefits, an important bulwark of civilization, and a divine institution similar or superior to the free labor in the North. This stance arose in response to the growing anti-slavery movement in the United States in the late 18th century and early 19th century. At this time, the anti-slavery contention that it was both economically inefficient and socially detrimental to the country as a whole was more prevalent than philosophical and moral arguments against slavery. However, this perspective rapidly changed as the worldwide demand for sugar and cotton from America increased, and the Louisiana Purchase opened up vast new territories ideally suited for a plantation economy. By the early 19th century, anti-slavery arguments began to depart from claims that it was economically inefficient and towards the contention that slavery was inherently immoral. In response, pro-slavery advocates fought against the abolitionists with their own morality-based defense, which invariably stressed their view that slaves were both well-treated and happy. A writer in 1835 asserted that American slavery is the best slavery there ever was.
We deny that slavery is sinful or inexpedient. We deny that it is wrong in the abstract. We assert that it is the natural condition of man, that there ever has been and there ever will be slavery. And we not only claim for ourselves the right to determine for ourselves the relations between master and slave, but we insist that the slavery of the southern states is the best regulation of slavery, whether we take into consideration the interests of the master or of the slave, that has ever been devised.
A narrative that enslaved Africans lived in a carefree, comfortable state dates back to the late 18th century. This argument mostly focused on the economic feasibility of enslaving people for their labor, despite the inherent subjugation and degradation of human beings. By the 1810s, a new rationale arose that began to treat legalized enslavement as a positive good and not as an economically necessary evil, while still affirming its alleged economic benefits. This new premise was first expressed by Robert Walsh in 1819.
The physical condition of the American Negro is on the whole, not comparatively alone, but positively good. And he is exempt from those racking anxieties, the exacerbates of despair, to which the English manufacturer and peasant are subject to in the pursuit of their pittance.
Such justification about the goodness of enslavement for those who were enslaved became more common in the 1820s. By the late 1820s, the defense of institutional slavery saw it as mutually beneficial for state governments, enslavers, and enslaved people alike. Legal enslavement drifted from being seen as an economic system of private enslavers to a political and philosophical position that portrayed enslavement as possessing national importance, providing benefits to the states, including more tax revenue. A well-known example of this new pro-enslavement approach was voiced by Governor Stephen D. Miller in his 1829 speech to South Carolina's legislators.
Slavery is not a national evil. On the contrary, it is a national benefit. The agricultural wealth of the country is found in those states owning slaves, and a great portion of the revenue of the government is derived from the products of slave labor. Slavery exists in some form everywhere, and it is not of much consequence in a philosophical point of view, whether it be voluntary or involuntary. In a political point of view, involuntary slavery had the advantage, since all who enjoy political liberty are then, in fact, free.
From this twisted mind frame, sadly, black captives suffered beyond measure in this dark chapter of time. Slaves endured unimaginable hardships, toiling under the scorching sun for the whole hours of the day, and facing systemic oppression on the sprawling plantations which dotted the landscape. The daily lives of these unfortunate individuals were marked by unspeakable suffering as they were subjected to grueling labor, dehumanizing treatment, and a constant lack of autonomy. But amidst the grim reality, a spark of resistance flickered in the darkness. Nat Turner. Benjamin Turner, Nat's slave master, had died in 1810, and his son Samuel inherited Nat. When he was 21, Nat Turner escaped from Samuel Turner, but he returned a month later after becoming delirious from hunger and receiving a vision that told him to return to the service of his earthly master. In 1830, Joseph Travis purchased Turner. Turner later recalled that Travis was a kind master who placed the greatest confidence in him. Turner had visions that he interpreted as messages from God and which influenced his life. The historian Patrick Breen stated, Nat Turner thought that God used the natural world as a backdrop in front of which he placed signs and omens. Breen further states that Nat Turner claimed he possessed a gift of prophecy and that he could interpret these divine revelations. Turner often conducted religious services, preaching the Bible to his fellow slaves, who dubbed him the Prophet. In addition to blacks, Turner garnered some white followers, such as Ethelred T. Brantley, whom Turner baptized after convincing him to cease from his wickedness. In 1824, Turner had a second vision while working in the fields for Thomas More. The Savior was about to lay down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and the great day of judgment was at hand. Historian David Allmendinger notes that Turner had 10 different supernatural experiences between 1822 and 1828. These included appearances of both the Spirit communicating through a religious language and Scripture, along with the visions of the Holy Ghost. By the spring of 1828, Turner was convinced that he was ordained for some great purpose in the hands of the Almighty. Turner said he heard a loud noise in the heavens while working in Moore's fields on May 12th, and the Spirit instantly appeared to me and said the serpent was loosened, and Christ had laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and that I should take it on and fight against the serpent. For the time was fast approaching when the first should be last and the last should be first. Historian and theologian Joseph Dryce says, in connecting this vision to the motivation for his rebellion, Turner makes it clear that he sees himself as participating in the confrontation between God's kingdom and the anti-kingdom that characterized his social historical context. During the 1820s, Turner was motivated by strong convictions, at least partly inspired by his religious beliefs, to organize his fellow slaves against enslavement. His deep spiritual commitment served as a significant influence on slaves within the surrounding plantations in Virginia. After Turner viewed the solar eclipse in 1831, he was certain that God wanted the revolt to commence. And just to make clear, not only was the suffering and unearthly tortures meted out on black slaves in that era the only factors which motivated Nat Turner's rebellion, but to add salt to injury, the man had it up to his neck when he was separated from his own family. After Samuel Turner died in 1823, Nat Turner was sold to Thomas More, and his family was sold to Giles Reese. By 1831, his son was enslaved by Piety Reese and lived on a farm that was near the Travis Farm, where Turner was enslaved. However, in February 1831, Reese's son John used Turner's son as collateral for a family debt. One historian notes that Turner approached his conspirators for the rebellion days after his son was used as collateral, and thus he had begun his walk into the inevitable, the rebellion. Over approximately a decade, Turner would build up support for his cause, culminating in an anti-slavery uprising that would serve as a source of inspiration for later abolitionist organizers and rebels. Turner thought that revolutionary violence would force whites to acknowledge the brutality of slavery. Therefore, he wanted to spread terror and alarm among whites. Turner began communicating his plans to a small circle of trusted fellow slaves. All his initial recruits were other slaves from his neighborhood. These scattered men had to find ways to communicate their intentions without revealing the plot. Songs may have tipped the neighborhood members to movements. It is believed that one of the ways Turner summoned fellow conspirators to the woods was through the use of particular songs. According to author Terry Bisson, Turner entrusted his wife, Cherry, with his most secret plans and papers. According to a report by James Tresvant immediately following the uprising, Cherry said that Nat had been digesting a plan for the revolt for years. Turner eagerly anticipated God's signal to slay my enemies with their own weapons. In the sweltering summer of 1831, a sense of restlessness settled over Southampton County, Virginia. Turner, with a fierce determination and deep understanding of the Bible, had been interpreting signs and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the sun eclipsed on February 12, 1831, Turner saw it as a divine signal to begin planning his rebellion, for he envisioned this as a black man's hand reaching over the sun. He shared his vision with 6 trusted friends, Henry, Hark, Nelson, and Sam, and together they started making preparations for a daring uprising. The plan was to kill all white people connected with slavery, including men, women, and children, and to march towards Jerusalem, Virginia, gathering supporters and momentum along the way. The rebellion was initially set to begin on July 4, 1831, but Turner fell ill, delaying the action. The conspirators used the delay to extend planning, However, another atmospheric phenomenon on August 13, 1831, which made the Virginia sun appear bluish-green, possibly the result of a volcanic plume produced by the eruption of Ferdinandea Island off the coast of Sicily, convinced Turner that the time had finally come. He had taken this as a divine signal and started the rebellion a week later, being August 21, 1831. The rebellion expanded from several trusted slaves to over 70 enslaved and free blacks, some of whom were on horseback. They were armed with knives, hatchets, and blunt instruments. Firearms were too difficult to collect and would have drawn unwanted attention. With a deep breath, Turner launched the rebellion, rallying his followers and embarking on a trail of destruction. The rebels killed white people without discriminating by age or sex. Turner's slave owner and his family were the first to be killed. The rebels then traveled from house to house, freeing slaves and killing whites. Historian Stephen B. Oates writes that Turner called on his group to kill all the white people. According to the Richmond Enquirer, Turner declared that indiscriminate slaughter was not their intention after they attained a foothold, and was resorted to, in the first instance, to strike terror and alarm. A few homes were spared because Turner believed the poor white inhabitants thought no better of themselves than they did of Negroes. The rebels also avoided the Giles Reese plantation, even though it was en route, likely because Turner wanted to keep his wife and children safe. The rebels had marched towards Jerusalem, fueled by their desire for freedom and revenge against their oppressors. They were met with fierce resistance from local militia, and despite their bravery, these 70 to 80 blacks were outnumbered in all sizes and eventually defeated.
The balance of sheer military power was weighted tremendously against the slaves in this country. Slaves don't have the organization, the access to arms, the military tradition to be able to mobilize a successful insurrection.
The state militia suppressed the rebellion at Belmont Plantation on the morning of August 23rd. By this time, the rebels had already killed between 55 and 65 whites. Men, women, children were not left out in the number before being defeated by the militia, making it the deadliest slave revolt in U.S. history. The militia had twice the manpower of the rebels and 3 companies of artillery. They had terribly wounded some of Turner's men, while the others were killed. Turner himself escaped into the woods and went into hiding. The retaliation was even more menacing than the rebellion itself. Within a day of suppressing the rebellion, the local militia was joined by detachments from the USS Natchez and USS Warren in Norfolk and militias from neighboring counties in Virginia and North Carolina. Brigadier General William Henry Broadnax commanded the Virginia militia.
The violent, brutal reaction is meant as a warning. It's meant to frighten those who might be contemplating acts like this in the future. It's meant to demonstrate the power of white society.
In Southampton County, blacks suspected of participating in the rebellion were beheaded by the militia, and their severed heads were mounted on poles at crossroads as a grisly form of intimidation. A local road, now Virginia State Route 658, was called Blackhead Signpost Road, after it became the site of one such display.
There's no question that there's a cult of violence that surrounds the tension between black and white during slavery times and after. It's hard for us to fathom cutting off people's heads and putting them on poles, parading them around, hanging bodies up in chains, dismembering the body, taking home souvenirs.
Rumors quickly spread that the slave revolt had spread as far south as Alabama. Fears led to reports in North Carolina of slave armies on highways, burning the white inhabitants of Wilmington, North Carolina, and marching on the state capitol. The fear and alarm resulted in white violence against blacks on flimsy pretenses. The editor of the Richmond Whig described the scene as the slaughter of many blacks without trial and under circumstances of great barbarity. The violence continued for 2 weeks after the rebellion.
We know all about the victims, the white victims of Turner's Rebellion, who they were, where they were killed, what their names were, what their families were. Nobody knows the names of even all the participants in the Turner Rebellion, and certainly all the innocent blacks who were killed or imprisoned or beaten afterwards. This is not part of our official historical memory. That piece of the story is just forgotten or suppressed and probably can never really be completely recovered.
In a letter to the New York Evening Post, Reverend G.W. Powell wrote that many Negroes are killed every day. The exact number will never be known. A company of militia from Hartford County, North Carolina, reportedly killed 40 blacks in one day and took $23 in a gold watch from the dead. Captain Solon Borland, leading a contingent from Murfreesboro, North Carolina, condemned the acts because it was tantamount to theft from the white owners of the slaves. The aftermath of the rebellion was in fact marked by brutal reprisals, with over 3,000 militia deployed to quell the uprising and hundreds of innocent slaves killed. There was widespread fear among the white population in the rebellion's aftermath. Between 36 and over 120 enslaved and free blacks, men, women, and children included, many of whom were not involved in the revolt, were killed by soldiers and local mobs in retaliation. Turner would evade capture for nearly 2 months, hiding in the dismal swamp in Southampton County. Meanwhile, Turner's wife, Cherry, was beaten and tortured by the authorities in an attempt to get her to reveal his plans and whereabouts. After a raid on the Reese plantation, the Richmond Constitutional Whig reported on September 26th that some papers were given up by his wife under the lash. Eventually, on October 30th, 1831, Nat Turner was discovered by a hunter and captured by Benjamin Phipps while he hid in a depression in the earth created by a large fallen tree covered with fence rails. This would be referred to locally as Nat Turner's Cave, although it was not a natural cave. Around 1 p.m. on October 31, Turner arrived at the prison in the county seat of Jerusalem, Virginia, now Cortland. While Turner sat in his cell awaiting trial, he was visited by the slave apologist, also a lawyer, Thomas R. Gray, who was tasked with documenting his confession. Before his execution, Turner would tell his story to Attorney Gray, who published the Confessions of Nat Turner in November 1831. Gray's records would later become a crucial historical account of the rebellion. Going forward, the trials and execution was a sad and bitter story. Dozens of suspected rebels were tried by courts specially convened for the rebellion. Turner was tried on November 5, 1831, for conspiring to rebel and making insurrection, and was convicted and sentenced to death. His attorney was James Strange French. Most of Turner's alleged conspirators were tried in Southampton County, with some cases extending to neighboring counties such as Sussex. Thomas Ruffin Gray, along with attorneys William Henry Broadnax and Meriwether Broadnax, represented many of the defendants. The verdicts were stark. 30 enslaved individuals were convicted, with 18 sentenced to death by hanging and 12 condemned to be sold out of state. In contrast, 15 defendants were acquitted. Among the free blacks who stood trial, 4 were found not guilty, while one unfortunate individual was sentenced to hang. During the rebellion, the Virginia General Assembly took drastic measures, introducing legislation that targeted free blacks with alarming severity. The proposed bills aimed to strip them of fundamental rights, including trial by jury, and instead subjected them to criminal punishment through enslavement and relocation. Meanwhile, slave owners, seeking reparations for slaves lost during the insurrection, submitted petitions to the General Assembly. At least 7 such pleas were made, each requesting compensation for the alleged losses incurred without trial. However, all these petitions were met with rejection, underscoring the Assembly's unyielding stance in the face of rebellion. This period marked a significant escalation in the crackdown on both enslaved and free black populations, reflecting the deep-seated fears and anxieties of the time. The legislative response not only sought to tighten control, but also highlighted the complexities and contradictions within the system of slavery and race relations in Virginia. The General Assembly debated the future of slavery the following spring. Some urged gradual emancipation, but the pro-slavery side prevailed after Virginia's leading intellectual, Thomas Roderick Dew, president of the College of William and Mary, published a pamphlet defending the wisdom and benevolence of slavery and the folly of its abolition. Therefore, seeing that Turner was also educated and a preacher, Laws were passed in all slave states except Maryland, Kentucky, and Tennessee, criminalizing teaching blacks to read and write and restricting blacks from holding religious meetings without a licensed white minister. The climate of fear and repression extended further, with southern states criminalizing the possession of abolitionist literature. These measures reflected a broader effort to tighten control over enslaved populations and suppress any dissenting voices. The legislative responses underscored the deepening entrenchment of slavery in the South, as lawmakers sought to preserve the institution at all costs. After trials, the Commonwealth of Virginia executed 56 enslaved people accused of participating in the rebellion, including Turner himself. Many black people who had not participated were also persecuted in the frenzy. When asked before his execution if he regretted what he had done, Turner responded, "Was Christ not crucified?"
Was not Christ crucified?
Was not Christ crucified? That's an astonishing statement by a man who's chained to the wall. You're going to be hanged the next day. And he's told that all your comrades are hanged, that your wife has been sold south, that you'll be hanged tomorrow. And he stands up from the cut and he says, "Was not Christ crucified?" Can you imagine that? It's one of the great moments in human history.
In the early hours of November 11th, 1831, Nat Turner was then led to the gallows, his spirit unbroken. As the noose tightened around his neck, he gazed out at the crowd, his eyes flashing with defiance. The trapdoor swung open, and Turner's body dangled in the air, a symbol of resistance against the oppressive system that had sought to crush him. He was beheaded as an example to frighten other would-be rebels. After his execution, Turner's body was dissected and flayed, with his skin being used to make souvenir purses. In October 1897, Virginia newspapers ran a story about Nat Turner's skeleton being used as a medical specimen by Dr. H.U. Stevenson of Towana, Virginia. Stevenson acquired the skeleton from a son of Dr. S.B. Keller. Dr. Keller claimed to have paid Turner $10 for his body while he was in jail. After the execution, Keller had Turner's bones scraped and hung as a medical specimen. In 2002, a skull said to have been Turner's was given to Richard G. Hatcher, the former mayor of Gary, Indiana, for the collection of a civil rights museum he planned to build there. In 2016, Hatcher returned the skull to two of Turner's descendants. Since receiving the skull, the family has temporarily placed it with the Smithsonian Institution, where DNA testing will be done to determine whether it is the authentic remains of Nat Turner. If the test yields positive results, the family plans to bury his remains next to his descendants. Another skull said to have been Turner's was contributed to the College of Worcester in Ohio upon its incorporation in 1866. When the school's only academic building burned down in 1901, the skull was saved by Dr. H.N. Mateer. Visitors recalled seeing a certificate signed by a physician in Southampton County in 1866 that attested to the authenticity of the skull. The skull was eventually misplaced. In November 1831, Thomas R. Gray published the Confessions of Nat Turner, based on research he conducted while Turner was in hiding and from conversations with Turner before the trial. The pamphlet sold 40,000 to 50,000 copies, making it a noted source about the rebellion at the time. But whites had doubts that a black slave could be to such an extent intelligent. A November 25, 1831, review of the publication by the Richmond Enquirer said, "The pamphlet has one defect. We mean its style. The confession of the culprit is given, as it were, from his lips, and when read to him, he admitted its statements to be correct. But the language is far superior to what Nat Turner could have employed. Portions of it are even eloquently and classically expressed. This is calculated to cast some shade of doubt over the authenticity of the narrative, and to give the bandit a character for intelligence which he does not deserve, and ought not to have received. In all other respects, the confession appears to be faithful and true." In the aftermath of the revolt, whites did not try to interpret Turner's motives and ideas. Antebellum enslavers were shocked by the rebellion and feared further slave violence. To them, Turner became a symbol of terrorism and violent retribution. Images were published depicting armed black men attacking white men, women, and children. These haunted white Southerners and showed slave owners how vulnerable they were. Northern and southern states shared many of the same fears. A proposal to create a college for African Americans in New Haven, Connecticut, was overwhelmingly rejected in the New Haven excitement. The fear Turner's rebellion caused and the concerns raised in the emancipation debates that followed resulted in politicians and writers defining slavery as a positive good. Thomas Dew was among those writers. Other Southern writers began to promote a paternalistic ideal of improved Christian treatment of slaves, in part to avoid such rebellions. Dew and others believed they were civilizing blacks, who were then still mostly American-born through slavery. Some Virginians wanted to remove all blacks from the state Tidewater and Piedmont regions, or deport all from the state. In 1852, the Virginia branch of the American Colonization Society sent 243 black Virginians to Liberia. African Americans have generally regarded Turner as a resistance hero for avenging the suffering of Africans and African Americans. James H. Harris, who has written extensively about the history of the black church, says that the revolt marked a turning point in the black struggle for liberation. According to Harris, Turner believed that only a cataclysmic act could convince the architects of a violent social order that violence begets violence. This rebellion had, for a fact, deepened the divide between slave-holding states and those opposed to slavery, contributing to the growing tensions that eventually led to the American Civil War. In an 1843 speech at the National Negro Convention, Henry Highland Garnet, a former slave and active abolitionist, described Nat Turner as patriotic, saying that future generations will remember him among the noble and brave. In 1861, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a white Northern writer, praised Turner in a seminal article published in the Atlantic Monthly. He described Turner as a man who knew no book but the Bible, and that by heart, who devoted himself soul and body to the cause of his race. In 1988, Turner was included in the Black Americans of Achievement biography series for children with the book Nat Turner, Slave Revolt Leader by Terry Bisson. The sword Turner is believed to have used in the rebellion is displayed at the Southampton County Courthouse. In 1991, the Virginia Department of Historic Resources dedicated the Nat Turner Insurrection Historic Marker on Virginia State Route 30 near Cortland, Virginia. Nat Turner's rebellion is also celebrated as part of Black August. To say the least, Turner's legacy is, in fact, boundless. Despite the tragic outcome, Nat Turner's rebellion remains a powerful testament to the enduring spirit of resistance against oppression and the fight for freedom and equality. Until today, Turner's legacy continues to inspire and captivate, serving as a reminder of the brutal reality of slavery and the desperation of those who fought against it. That brings us to the end of yet another memorable video. Don't forget to support our works by hitting the thumb button below. Share content with your friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and subscribe to stay tuned in with the channel if you are yet to. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.